So in this part, we're going to go from start to finish to get Laravel Airlock installed in a Laravel project, of course, and we are going to configure it properly. And just at the end of this part, we're going to create a really small Vue application to test that this works. So of course, the first thing is to have a Laravel project set up. I don't have one set up at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and do this using Composer Create Project. And I'm going to be using Laravel 7 here. Now that's really important because Laravel 7 comes pre-bundled with cross-origin resource sharing support, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but that's really important for getting this working because we're going to be sending potentially cross-origin requests over to Laravel from a single page application. So once this is finished, we'll go ahead and open this up in our text editor and we'll get Airlock installed and configured. Okay, so that is all downloaded. Let's go into that directory I've just created. What I'm not going to do here is use anything like Laravel Valet or Homestead to get this working. Instead, what I'm going to do is just really simply go ahead and run phpartisan serve to boot up a local web server with PHP. Now the reason that I'm doing this is when we're testing this, when we're developing locally, we want everything to be on the same domain. So if you're using Laravel Airlock to authenticate on a single page application, it's going to need to come from the same domain. So you'll need to serve these both from localhost. You see the IP here is 127.0.0.1, but we're going to just switch that out for localhost. So the first thing I'm going to do is just open this up in the browser just to make sure this is all working. And I'm going to replace this out with localhost just in case we're sending any requests through from here. So that's of course the first stage. The second stage is to get Airlock installed. Just before we do that, let's go and just configure out our database because of course we're going to need a user to test this kind of authentication. And I have one just here called Fresh. So what I'm going to do is just switch over some of the credentials that I have over in here. So I'm actually using Postgres here. It doesn't matter if you're using MySQL, this is going to work in exactly the same way. I'm just going to switch over all of this information. So for me, the username is my name and the password is empty. So of course, what I can now do is just opening up this in a new tab. So let's go over to that directory again. I'm going to run phpartisan migrate to migrate the default users table. And while we're here, why don't we just go ahead and run phpartisan tinker and go ahead and use our factory helper with the app model, user model, sorry, to create out a user. So just so we've got something to play around with. So let's go ahead and add my email address just into here. That's alex@codecourse.com. And let's also add my name in here so we can verify this when we're authenticating. And also, really importantly, a password as well. So for this, I'll just use the bcrypt helper. And let's go ahead and just say I love cats. Great. So that is a user created over in the database. Let's just go over and make sure all of that is in there correctly. And we're pretty much set up to go. You might be implementing this in an existing app, in which case you'll probably have all of this stuff in there already. So the first thing we need to do is talk about the two different uses of Laravel Airlock. The first one is API tokens. The next one is SPA, which is single page application authentication. What we're not going to be doing here is issuing any tokens. We're going to completely ignore this section of the documentation because for single page application authentication, this works completely differently to issuing tokens. We do have a course on this, but that's not what we're covering just now. So we're going to head straight down to the SPA authentication section after we've got Laravel Airlock installed and configured. So of course, the first thing that we need to do is just pull this in. So let's do a require on this. We're going to publish the configuration. That's really important because we've got a couple of things to configure in there. And that's also going to be really important when you push this to a production environment as well. Of course, locally you're developing on localhost, but when you push this to production, you're going to have domain names, potentially subdomain names, and all that kind of stuff. So let's publish that configuration. So that's good to go. And we're going to go ahead and migrate as well. Now, the migrations in this sense don't really make sense because these are the personal access tokens, which I've just said we're not going to be using. But I'm going to migrate these anyway, just so we have them in there and we don't run into any trouble. So the next thing and the last thing we need to do to really just configure this is add in the ensure front-end requests are stateful middleware to the API section of our kernel. So let's go over to the text editor. Let's open up our HTTP kernel, come down to the API section. Of course, this doesn't apply to web authentication. And let's add that middleware just into there. And of course, we want to pull the full namespace for that in just at the top. So now we pretty much have Airlock set up and ready to go. But there are a couple of other things that we need to configure to get this working. And this is, as I've seen around the web, been a massive pain point for some people. So just before we do that, let's head down to the SPA authentication section and just leave that here. And let's go over and start to configure out everything that we need. Now, the first thing to note is I'm using Laravel 7 here, as I mentioned earlier. If we come over to the config section, you'll notice that the Laravel cores package, which I've pulled in multiple courses, is already included in Laravel 7. So if we just head over to our kernel again, you'll notice this handle cores middleware, which you would typically have to pull down as a separate package, but this is now being included by default in Laravel 7. So if you are working with a Laravel installation older than 7, you can still do this, but you'll need to pull in the cores package separately. And I've just pulled up a link for that here, so you can go ahead and install that and copy over that middleware. So that's pretty much what you'd need to do if you're not working with Laravel 7. Now, the first thing that we need to configure here are our paths. Now, if you're not aware of cross-origin resource sharing, this basically allows us to control how and what applications or what requests can come into our application. So, for example, the allowed methods that we give, the allowed origins, by default, this is set to an asterisk, so any origin can send a head or a post request to our applications, but you'll probably want to limit this to your production domain or your local domain. So we're going to ignore that stuff for now, but we are going to set the paths just inside of here. Now, the paths that we're going to be working with are obviously all of our API routes. That's in there by default, and that's a kind of a given. But we also want to allow cross-origin resource sharing on the login page. The reason being is we're going to be sending a request to the standard login route within Laravel once we've set all this up. This isn't part of our API. This is actually posting through to the same route and using the same controller that you would do on the web. So we don't need to create any new endpoints when we work with Laravel Airlock. Now, likewise, we also want to be able to log out as well. So we're also going to go ahead and include logout on our list of cross-origin paths as well. Now, finally, and we'll come to this a little bit later because this won't make sense at the moment, but we also have a cross-site request forgery cookie endpoint, which comes as part of the Airlock package. I'm not going to go into detail of that just in a minute because we're going to be looking at how we work with this and what it actually does, but we're going to want to add that in there as well. So we'll include that now. Now, the other thing that we want to do is set supports credentials to true because we are going ahead and authenticating with our API. So we're going to go ahead and set that value to true. Now, we've not even touched the Airlock configuration at the moment. It's actually very simple. There are only 3 keys in here. First is stateful, expiration, and middleware. Now, we're not going to touch either of these because that's completely up to you. But the stateful part of this, the stateful domains part of this, is really important. So you can see here requests from the following domains or hosts will receive stateful API authentication cookies, e.g. these are the domains that you want to be able to allow your users to authenticate with. Now, by default, these are, or this is just set to localhost, but if you did have a list of domains that you wanted to include here, you can go ahead and add them to your env file. So if you come down to the end of your env file, you might have localhost and then you might have your actual production domain. But of course, because we're working with env files here, it's likely that you could just overwrite this to your local your production domain. But we'll leave this at localhost for now because that is of course what we're doing. We're working locally on our machine. Now, the next thing that we need to do after we've configured our cross-origin resource sharing stuff and our Airlock configuration is come over to our session configuration, and this is incredibly important. Airlock will not work without this change. And what we need to do is we need to come down to the domain section. So let's go all the way down to our domain section. And at the moment, this is set to a default value of null or whatever is set, of course, in your session domain configuration. Now, with this, what we need to do is we need to set this to the same domain that we're sending a request through on our single page application. So from the client to the API, this needs to match, and that's for a very good reason. We'll see this in action later, but the gist of it is that when you are trying to set cookies from an API onto a client, you need the domains to match, or Chrome or whichever other browser that you're working with will probably not set these. So of course what we can either do is come over to our env file and add this in. So let's put this under our session bit just here, and we're going to set this to localhost. And of course, if you're working with subdomains, you can do dot and then codecourse.com. So that would work for any subdomain. But of course, because we're working locally here now, we just need the value of localhost. Now, to be honest, that is pretty much it. Within Laravel, a default Laravel installation, we already have a endpoint just in here over on our API routes. So when we get to creating a really simple example view app and sending a request through to here, once we are logged in with the cookies that are set from the API, we should be able to access this information. But really importantly, what we need to do is set this over to auth and airlock. So that will use the airlock middleware to authenticate that based on the cookie that's been set on the client. So at this point, things might be a little bit murky. How are we actually authenticating with this? We've done the setup, but it doesn't seem entirely clear how Laravel actually does this. And let's just hop over to Postman just to show you this endpoint here. Remember, this is the endpoint that we added to our cores settings a little bit earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and send a GET request to this. And this is exactly what we're going to be doing over on our single page application. You can see we get a 204 no content status back, because of course there is no content to this. But what this endpoint does is it will give us back a couple of cookies. So it will give us our cross-site request forgery token cookie, which when we then send over to our login endpoint, we have the X cross-site request forgery token header set. And that means that we can actually send requests over to our API using cross-site request forgery protection, and we don't need to manually send that through or disable cross-site request forgery protection. So again, that might not make sense, but what we're going to do now is set up a really simple Vue.js app to actually validate that authentication works now that we have Laravel Airlock set up. So let's go over and quickly set that up now. Okay, so I'm over on the Vue CLI homepage. This is what we're going to be doing just to verify that everything is working. You can do all of this through Postman, but to be honest, it's quite fiddly. And I feel a lot comfortable just really quickly prototyping a Vue project to verify that our authentication works. So if you don't have this installed already, go ahead and run npm install global on Vue CLI, and then come over to the creating a project section. You can run instant prototyping, but this isn't too much trouble to get set up. So let's go over to a new tab, and I'm going to go into the fresh app, and I'm actually going to go ahead and create this in here within the Laravel directory. You wouldn't necessarily do this because you'd probably have it on a completely different repository, but we'll go ahead and do this anyway. So let's just head over to manually select features. I'm going to disable linting just so we don't get annoyed with anything, and we don't want to save this as a future preset. So let's just wait for this to install, go into it, set this up, install Axios, and start sending requests and see if we can authenticate. Okay, so that's all installed. Let's go into the client, and just before I run this app, I'm going to go ahead and do an npm install on Axios just so I can make some HTTP requests over to our client. And remember, when we boot this single page app up, we're going to have the domain. If we just run npm run serve, the domain's going to be localhost. So the really important thing here, and I can't stress this enough, is that the domain here matches our API domain. So both of them domains match, and we have them configured over in our Laravel session configuration. That's very important. Okay, so we've got our client set up. Let's just go into our text editor, and let's just open this up and just focus on getting this working. So let's pull all this out, and let's go over to our main app file. I'm just going to get rid of all of this. We don't really need any of this stuff in here whatsoever. Let's just create out a new script section in here, and let's go ahead and just pop something in there like hello. And let's come over, and there we go. Great. Okay, so there are a couple of steps to authenticate now that you have Airlock set up on your Laravel app. Let's go ahead and import Axios, of course, so we can make some requests. So let's pull this in from the Axios module, and let's go ahead and just create a mounted hook inside of here. And in fact, we don't really need that. Let's go ahead and create out a button that we can log in with. That'll do just for now. So let's create out a method in here called login. And this is where we're, of course, going to send them requests. So let's just go and say click prevent, and we'll reference the login method that we've defined, just so we know this is all working. I'm just going to log something out. So let's come over to the browser. open this up, and the network tab here and the application tab in Chrome is going to be really important. You can see I've got a couple of cookies set here, but I'm actually going to get rid of them because typically you wouldn't have them. They're just from a previous project I was working on. So sure enough, if we click login, that's going to go ahead and sign us in. And now what I can actually do is talk you through how Airlock authenticates. So the first thing that we need to do is, the first thing you think you would do is send a request to the login page. So let's make this method asynchronous and let's await on Axios post. And of course, we're just using the full domain here, but typically you'd have that tucked away in config. And let's go ahead and make a post request to login and let's pass some credentials in. Now I registered a user earlier using Tinker. So let's go ahead and send my email address across like so. And let's of course send my password across with this request as well, which was I love cats. Okay, so let's head over to the browser and click login. We actually get 404, that's absolutely fine. That's just because we haven't installed the Laravel UI package. So let's go ahead and just do a composer require here on Laravel/UI. That will bring in, at least with version 7 of Laravel, all of our authentication routes and controllers. So let's go ahead and install this first of all. And let's just run PHP Artisan UI just so we can see the help for this. And what we want to do is run PHP Artisan UI, and we want just the bootstrap templating. It doesn't really matter what we do here. And we want to pass the auth flag as well. Okay, so now that we've done that, we should actually have that endpoint available. So now I click login. You can see that sure enough, that is no longer a 404 request, but instead we get a cross-site request forgery token mismatch. Now that kind of makes sense because we don't have a cross-site request forgery cookie set that is sending through to our API to verify this. Now one of the fixes for this would of course just be to come over to your verify cross-site request forgery token middleware and just exclude the API altogether. But Laravel Airlock handles all of this for us, so there's no point in excluding this because we can actually grab our cross-site request forgery cookie, automatically set it so Axios will go ahead and send this along with every request. So you get the benefit of cross-site request forgery protection on your API. Now what we need to do just before we do anything else, come over to main.js. I'm going to go ahead and import Axios from here. And I'm going to go ahead and set some default, or one default on Axios at least. And that is the with credentials section. So I'm going to say Axios defaults, and I'm going to set with credentials to true. Now we'll see this come into effect a little bit later. It's nothing to do with cross-site request forgery, but let's figure out how we automatically, when we try and authenticate, grab the cross-site request forgery information from Laravel Airlock and set it to cookies within our application so any subsequent requests send that along as well. So what we want to do now, before we send a request, a post request over to login, we want to go ahead and make a get request to, of course, the same domain, but this time we want to send a request to that Airlock cross-site request forgery cookie endpoint. Now what this is going to do is it's going to grab the cross-site request forgery cookie, set it within the browser, so when we send a request to log in, that cross-site request forgery cookie is going to be sent along in the header, and therefore the cross-site request forgery error should go. So let's keep an eye on our network tab, click on login, and sure enough, we actually get a 500, but that's a completely separate issue. At least we know now we're not getting a cross-site request forgery issue come back. Now the reason that I've got 500 here is simply because I changed over my env files and I've already started up a server. So I'm going to come over to here, exit out of this, rerun it, and that'll bring my env variables back into the Laravel config. So let's click login, and now we get a 204 no content for our login page. Now, by sending the request to this cross-site request forgery cookie endpoint, what actually happened was, you can see here, it set the cross-site request forgery token and it set the Laravel session as well. So all of this looks pretty good. Now what we can try and do is, after we have signed in, we can send another get request across to /API/user, and we can actually go ahead and dump the result. So let's go ahead and assign this and let's log on the response data and let's see what we get back from this. So let's come over to our console, hit login, and it actually looks like we get an error here. This is just one thing that we didn't configure. So if we come over to our env file just here, at the moment we have our session driver set to a file. We actually need to switch this over to cookie. So let's come over to the terminal. Let's cancel this off. Let's run PHP Artisan cache clear just to make sure that that value isn't being saved in there. And let's rerun PHP Artisan serve. So let's give this a refresh on the front end. Let's head over to our network tab, hit login. And now you can see what's happened is the cross-site request forgery cookie endpoint was successful. What that did is it set that cookie that we looked at earlier for the cross-site request forgery token. We then send a request to login, which again gives us 204 no content, but this was successful. That would have now set a different cookie. So this is now our authentication cookie, which allows us on subsequent requests to get back the information about the currently authenticated user. So there's quite a lot of setup here. There's quite a lot of configuration to do. But once you have this in place, what you can now do is send a request to any endpoint with that cookie that's been stored in here, and your users will be authenticated. Now, just to demo this out, let's head over to the app.view file that we were working on earlier, and let's get rid of these two requests just here. And why don't we can just re-click that button. But the important thing to note here is we're not doing this again. We've already done that. That's purely just for cross-site request forgery stuff. And we're not re-authenticating. What we are doing is using the pre-existing cookie that's been set, trying to get back this information. So if I now go over and give this a refresh and click login, you can see that I'm still authenticated. I'm authenticated up to the point that I send another request to our API to log us out, or if this cookie expires or is deleted. So I can actually go ahead and send a logout post request to the logout route within Laravel. That's protected by cross-site request forgery, but of course we have our cross-site request forgery token being sent, so that will be successful, and it will invalidate that cookie, and therefore we will no longer be authenticated. But I can just manually get rid of this one just to show you that works. You can see here that we get a 401 unauthorized. So that was quite long, but once you've got to this point and you've tested this out really briefly using a sample Vue.js app, you know that this works now. So you can send this from Vue.js if you're working with Vue, Nuxt if you're working with that Nuxt framework, or anything else that you need to use this for.